Good morning. A couple days ago, I received an email from a student who is running for governing council, and we don't allow students who are running for the Engineering Society or governing council or anything to actually make announcements to the class, but I thought I would pass on his announcement. There will be a slide starting next week that has this information, but he just definitely wanted you to know that student reps are now running for governing council, and that you can and that you should vote. It was not his intention to actually campaign for himself. Find out who the nominees are and vote for a student for governing council. It's good to have engineering students on governing council. So, this week, next week, and the following week, you are working on a bunch of things that set the foundations for the project for this term. And those are the things I'm going to talk about today. Some of it is familiar, and so I'll review some of the concepts for the project requirements. Some of it is new. The project requirements have a couple of new sections that may prove a bit tricky. There's a client meeting, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll start with that actually. And then there's also a new assignment called the preliminary, the preliminary lessons learned and strategies. And this is a unique assignment that will be due a little bit after the project requirements. It's an assignment that doesn't take a lot of intensive work the night before. In order to do it successfully, you have to do it a little bit at a time all through the term. And so I want to emphasize that and help you get started. This image is an image of the foundation of the 104-story Freedom Tower, taken about 10 years ago. The Freedom Tower is finally completed. And it just gives you an idea of the kind of complexity a foundation takes. And that's the kind of complexity you're looking at in the virtual foundations that you are setting this week, next week, and the following week. Aside from foundations, the other thing you're setting up right now are relationships. And there's a whole set of different relationships. These relationships can be they can be closer relationships, the relationships in your team, and they become more and more formal relationships as you move to the relationship with your teaching assistant, your communication instructor, and your project manager, and your client. However familiar the relationship, it is not the same as a relationship with friends or family. All of these relationships require a certain amount of distance and a certain amount of respect. Even if you really like your team, and even if, in fact, as a result of this course, you and some of your team members remain friends for life, and it does happen, you still have to respect the working environment as having some familiarities and some boundaries that you cannot cross within the working environment. There's a difference between the teamwork and the things you will do and say to one another when you are just friends. So you'll be setting up a relationship with your client in the client meeting. Either you've already done that this week, or next week your tutorials are elective. You don't have to go to the tutorial. They're optional. That's the word I'm looking for. And that's in order to set up a time where every team member is available and can go to a meeting. We know that it is possible your client might not be available in that little 2 hours, but we're trying to make it easy for every teammate to attend the meetings, because this is a very important part of your professionalization, is your ability to go to a meeting, meet with a client, and discuss things in a professional manner. Excuse me. You will be creating your relationship with your teaching assistant, your communication instructor, and your project manager largely through the project requirements at this point. And so remember, the impression that they're going to get of you, of your work ethic, and of your commitment is going to be through that document largely. And so you want to make a very good impression at that point because it will benefit you later. And finally, you'll be working with your CI more closely this term than you did last term around the document, the reflective document, the lessons learned and strategy. And the first stage of that is quite an informal stage where you're going to be observing yourself and your performance in the team and describing what it is you see. So the client meeting. This is a quote from Professor Hans Kunoff. If you're in one of his tutorials, you've probably heard this, but he mentioned it at the team meeting this week. And I thought it was such a great quote that I would pass it on to everybody who's not in his tutorial. He was talking about being at the meeting on time, and his definition, engineering, a biomedical engineering definition of on time is 5 minutes early. Get there 5 minutes early and you're on time. Get there on time and you're late, and 5 minutes late is unacceptable. So when you're making your plan, I think that's a really good policy to keep in mind. I'm going to take my jacket off because I'm hot, but I wanted to keep it on long enough to say this is business casual. I'm wearing a shirt. It's a button-down shirt. It could be button-down or non-button-down. It could be a polo shirt. It wouldn't really matter. It's a clean shirt. I took it out of its packaging this morning from the dry cleaner. I'm wearing a jacket. You don't have to wear a jacket. You can wear a sweater. I'm wearing pants. I could be wearing a skirt, but I don't wear skirts, but skirts are fine. And I'm wearing shoes, not running shoes. And I am not wearing cologne or aftershave or any form of scent. I never do because I have a chemical sensitivity, and any form of cologne makes me nauseous. You do not know in advance whether your client has a chemical sensitivity, but you know whether or not you have to put on cologne. So since you don't have to do it, it's worth not doing it so that you don't make your client nauseous. That's not a really good first impression. You walk in, your client vomits, you know? So, no cologne, aftershave, perfume, or scent. The other thing, one of the things that's going to keep you tied in, and it's the thing that keeps you tied in to any situation, and that is take notes. Taking notes, and I know some people feel that taking notes interrupts from being able to concentrate on what's being said. But you can only concentrate on what's being said for a limited amount of time, and then your mind may start to wander to other things. When you give yourself the task of noticing important items and writing them down, you help your memory, but more important than that, you help yourself keep concentrated and keep paying attention. I know this because, you know, in my other life, I've had to do things like, well, even in this life, I have to do things like a whole day of interviews, or I had to do a whole day of watching people every 10 minutes come in and do an audition. And it becomes mind-numbing unless you've given yourself the task of taking notes, because it gives you something to do and it keeps you involved. So take notes. Don't ask if you can record the meeting. I know that recording will grab all the details and keep them, but it doesn't promote relationship. It just really is a convenience for you. And nowadays with the internet, many of us are very sensitive about what is recorded and what other people may own of our personal personal image or voice. So no recording, but do take notes. Be prepared. Somebody said in the team meeting, bring a tape measure. And if you're doing a virtual, a software kind of project, a tape measure might not help that much. But be prepared in case you're shown around to be able to take the measurements or notes that will come in handy later. If pictures are going to be handy, then as you're being shown around, you can ask if you can take photographs. In some locations, that will not be allowed. Don't assume it is. I've gone to some engineering places where you walk through a metal detector and you go through like a series of security checks. It's very cool. So professionalism means developing a lot of relationships at different levels. This is called high. Whoops. My writing is so terrible. And that means that these are the people, they're inside your discipline and they're inside your project, and they understand the most, that they have the highest degree of understanding of what you understand, and you can talk to them and communicate most efficiently. So you can use jargon, acronyms, but, and this is your team, but your TA, your client, and your PM are mid-context. That means they have some understanding of the project, some understanding of the discipline, depending where they sit in this spectrum. They require explanations, and do not assume that you can use jargon or acronyms Do not assume that you can use jargon or acronyms or course terms with them. Because saying something to the client like, we just want to clarify the stakeholder interests may not mean anything to the client. Some clients may be engineers from different disciplines. They may think in terms of functional requirements, but not in terms of functions, objectives, and constraints. Some people, when you talk about an objective goal, will not know what that is. So make sure that when you're working with the mid-context members, you're not dumbing it down, but you're explaining what you mean. You're being clear. And you're not just throwing acronyms about thinking that that shows professionalism. It doesn't actually show professionalism. The purpose of acronyms, the function of acronyms and jargon, is efficiency within a community that shares them. And you don't have to show off that you're part of that community when you're talking about those things with somebody outside that community. Time for a question. The primary purpose of the project requirements is to A, impress the client with jargon and acronyms of the course. B, repeat back to the client exactly what the client wants. C, explain the design problem in engineering terms. D, provide a quick solution to the client's problem. This is a quick review question, not a difficult one. Another 10 seconds. We've got about 530 people here in the room, so we'll cut it off there. There we go. And the people in the room all got it right. Excellent. So 531 at 33. It shouldn't be, oh well, it sometimes is a little slow. So yes, explain the design problem in engineering terms. Obviously, you don't want to impress the client with jargon because that'll just be confusing. And you neither want to be solution driven at this point, nor, and this is one of the hardest things. It's really hard to deal with the client when you and the client may be trying to negotiate a different perspective of what the problem is. And that's the negotiation that's going to go on in the project requirements. And so I just wanted to, somebody asked on Piazza when they were getting a template for the project requirements. There's no template, but there is the instructions which are up. And you'll notice the instructions look very familiar, except for the two new sections, the client ethics and values and the project management plan. So, if you'll remember from last term, one of the things that we emphasized was that in terms of critical thinking, the project requirements demonstrates your ability to see a problem from multiple perspectives. So that is, you have to see the client's perspective, but not just the client's perspective. You also have to see it from an engineering perspective. But not just from an engineering perspective, you also have to see it from multiple perspectives of others who may be affected by the design and whose interests may be negatively impacted by the design. And you have to see it from the perspective of non-human others, the perspective of the environment, the perspective of animals, the perspective of everything around. And in terms of being an ethical engineer, this wide set of perspectives are what you identify and incorporate into the project requirements. And because at this point, I think you understand very well that technical solutions are almost invariably complicated by situational realities and opposing interests. So normally, I talk about the executive summary at the end because it's good to write it after everything else has been written. And that's why on this slide, what I put on the slides, so that everybody has the information, are things that I think are really important for every team. And one of the most important things about the executive summary is that you set internal deadlines that allow the poor person who has been given the task of the executive summary to actually do their job. If people deliver their section the night before the document is due, then the person who is doing the executive summary gets to start it at 2 a.m. And that's not really fair. And so you have to set your deadlines understanding. You have to build your Gantt chart understanding that this task is dependent on, has dependencies that precede it, and all of them have to allow that resource to work. I was thinking this morning as I was going over my notes, you wouldn't go up to somebody and say, okay, I got this great plan, I got this great idea, give me $100,000, I'll give you the details later. And an executive summary that is ineffective does just that. It says, oh, well, we've got this idea, we've got this information, you got to look in the document, but give us the money anyway. Remember, the executive summary will either do one of two things. It'll either give a good first impression to somebody in power to fund your project, or it'll give them a good only impression, because that's all they're going to read. If it gives a bad first impression, you're not telling me everything, or a bad only impression, you're not going to succeed in getting what you want as easily as if it gives a good first impression. And that means it's its own document. It's your document, but compressed. It's the 2-minute version, but it has everything in it, and it has its own flow. It cannot just be cut and pasted from other places and left like that. That won't be a good read. It has to be a good read on its own. It's not part of the document. This is one of those peculiar conventions that defies common sense, and we'll run into them again and again and again. All these conventions that defy common sense. Goes with the document, but it's not part of the document. Has no citations and no page number. I've given you an example here, and so we'll take a minute to read it, of an introduction between 1.0 and 1.1, because the instructions give a high-level introduction to the project are not very intuitive to follow. So here's one example. So just take a moment and read it, because it's not in the printed notes. Is there a word count for the PR? Yeah, there is a word count for the PR. It's between 1,200 and 1,500 words. Basically the same as last term. So you see, they have introduced their client and the context, where the client lives, what the client sees, and they've started to, and they also do quite a nice preview of what the document is going to contain and why that's important. And that's kind of unusual, that this section will be a tool for comparing potential designs. So that's a really, they did some good individual thinking there. The problem statement identifies the context and the gap. Many, many people ask, and many people incorporate lots of functions and objectives and constraints, but that's not really what the problem statement should focus on. The problem statement should focus on defining the problem from engineering terms. What's really going on here? And this group starts with what the client has requested and begins to discuss it, to explore it in scientific terms. They don't really come up with what they will eventually determine to be the focus of the design, but they do get to the gap, which has to do with the reflectivity of the windows. Introductions are probably the most valuable and useful parts of the document for people to take control of the reader and help the reader interpret what they are about to read in the way that the writers want the reader to interpret it. They are probably the least exploited of these valuable tools. This team does an excellent job of introducing their functions, including a diagram, in a way that starts to transform this whole idea from one of a bird attacking its image in the glass to one of a technology to improve the functions of glass such that birds won't attack it or see through it, but people on the other side will be able to see through it. And so they create a really good introduction to functions that helps the reader a lot more than the very vague functions or what the design should do. Objectives have two parts, and these are very, very, very difficult. You know, it isn't really that straightforward to create objectives and goals. Objectives are adjectives that describe the qualities of the functions or the qualities of the design, not the objectives of the project. So if the project is to increase profit, that's really the project, not the design. How is the design? What functions in the design are going to help that? Those are what you're going to look at. We get a lot of user-friendly, and you know I'm very unfriendly to the term friendly because it's anthropomorphic and the design is not a friendly thing. Although, you know, I understand in 2017 that we now have all these designs that are trying to be friendly. Hi, just ask me to remind you to buy eggs tomorrow. You know, every time I open my computer, it has that message for me. If I asked it to remind me to buy eggs tomorrow, every time it greets me, like, do you know how many eggs I would have at this point? I could feed this class 5 times over every week. My system is trying to be friendly. That's not what user-friendly really means. User-friendly means that a system can be used easily and intuitively. And fortunately, there's a lot of information on the internet about heuristics so that we can find values that define ease of use in terms of the project that we're working on. This is just one, and I've posted the actual article in the notes to this lecture. These are Jacob Nielsen's. This is a pretty famous heuristics. And so what I decided to do is I kind of went, okay, these are fine, but as you can see, they're nouns, and I've asked for adjectives. How do you turn these into adjectives and not friendly? So some of them are easy. Visibility becomes visible. Now, what does visible mean? You can determine goals around font size or other things. In Nielsen's case, visibility means keeping the reader informed about what's going on. That is, the feedback is always clear. One of the things that's very scary, and probably you've never encountered this because computer technology is so advanced, one of the things that's very scary is when your computer is just sort of grinding away at something and you have no idea what. You know, and when my computer's been in trouble and there's been a technical person helping me, very often you get that conversation where you go, what's going on, what's going on, what's going on? And the computer person says, well, don't worry, it's working. And that's because they know. But visibility means I know too. And you know that what I'm talking about is, you know, a little circle that's going around and around and around. That's just telling me the computer's working. Or a bar that's slowly filling up and telling me, oh, it's going to take a minute to finish. Oh, no, 30 seconds. Oh, no, 2 minutes. Oh, no, 45 seconds. All of those are feedback that make the working of the process visible. Matching between the system and the real world, I came up with recognizable. But I don't know. Recognizable, and recognizable suits a lot of the other heuristics like consistency and standards. So consistency and standards means the on and off switch looks like every other on and off switch. It's familiar. Familiar is another really good usability adjective. And it supports a lot of these, like recognition rather than recall. What recognition rather than recall means is that you don't have to learn a process, you can see it. So we moved to that. You know, when I started on computers, the computer had a second keyboard, or a third keyboard, along the side. It still does along the top, but it was more important then. And it had all the command keys in it. And so you had to memorize which command keys would do what while you were typing in your document, because you would literally be putting in commands inserted the way you do when you code. And most of us had a little template we would stick over it because we couldn't remember all of that. You couldn't remember what FA meant or you know, just didn't. Nowadays, a lot of those things are symbolized with icons that are much easier to remember, or they look like what they're going to do. Minimalist, that's, you know, when people talk about aesthetics and minimalism, again, that's a really interesting usability feature. It doesn't mean pretty. It means there won't be anything unnecessary. And so that helps the user because everything is right there. The one that I had the most trouble with was error prevention. And error prevention is huge in software design. It's really fabulous, and it's made our lives so much better. It's where you take a use case and you go, here's what has to happen, and then you go, here are all the things that will go wrong. And as you're building the code, you create in the code workarounds for everything that goes wrong so that the user doesn't get error messages. The system just takes care of it. I don't know quite how to transfer that into an adjective. So I worked on this and tried to create objectives, and with those objectives, some goals, matching. Some of these are on-off goals, and some of them are more testable, like feedback or the display change. Some of that can be timed or tested. But my final realization around doing this is that when you're looking at usability and when you're looking at a lot of the objectives, give your team time to work them out, because they're not easy to articulate in a meaningful way to the client and to set testable limits to. We have time for a question. Oh, good. This is images. Using photographs in engineering documents, you should be aware that they can be interpreted in many ways. They contain too much information to be useful. They cannot identify how something looks. They contain too little information to be useful. Okay, another 5 seconds. And cut it off. That's correct. They can be interpreted in many ways. That's the whole benefit of a photograph, as well as its limitation in engineering documents. They're very nice. They do contain a lot of information. Not really too much information to be useful, because they really do a good job of identifying what something looks like. But they contain a lot of information, and so that information can be interpreted in a number of ways. So the client ethics and values is a new section, and the person leaving is obviously not writing that section or the Gantt chart, so that'll be okay. And here's an example of a client ethics and value section. So you can take a minute to read it. Students ask, how do we find out the client's ethics and values? Obviously, when you go into the client meeting, you can't just say to the client, what are your values? It's not a rude question, it's just a huge question, or a huge question, depending on who you are. And it's too difficult to answer. You can ask questions about the relative importance, like why is building a robot important? Or sometimes the client gives away their values right off the bat without even being prompted. The robotics client has talked about why he feels robots are so important and how they offer this opportunity to learn so many engineering skills, all focused on one function. And so you can ask them about the project. A lot of values get extrapolated from language. We have one team who has a client who has exhibited extreme bias in their client statement. And extreme bias and other values may provide great challenges for this section. Students have a lot of trouble when their clients belong to religious institutions talking about religious values with objective, neutral language. So, I remember in one case, a team was working with a church group and wrote, "The church believes in the values of Jesus." And that's a value-laden sentence. We actually don't have to question or address where the values are coming. We just have to understand this is a religious institution and it follows the values of its religion. And that will be neutral enough. When you're dealing with extreme bias that's non-religious bias and presenting alternate points of view, you do have to acknowledge that the client does not like the current government or something like that. And so these are difficult questions, but some of them will become apparent with the client meeting, and you can work with your CI and your TA and your PM in determining the best way to articulate them. Other places to find information are company websites. Again, the mission statement, the value statements may be there. And people often write about themselves on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is another really valuable resource. The project management plan is just that small part of the Gantt chart that is of concern to the client. Your Gantt chart's going to go to your project manager, and it breaks everything down so that your project manager can keep track of who's doing what and who's on track. Your client doesn't need all of that. Your client just needs to know, what are the major steps? What do I need to know in the immediate future? And what do I have to look out for in the far future? And so This is an example of one project management plan. I think it's a really good approach. It's from a project requirements. It has a nice, reasonable, understandable introduction in a few sentences, and then a little table that gives a range of dates. It's a really good example of how to do this. It's 9:51, and I want to get to my last slide, so I'm going to skip the next top hat question, but try to find time for an extra one in my next lecture, and talk a little bit about the preliminary lessons learned and strategies document. So this is an observation document of you in your team and how the team is working. The best place for this document to begin is in your engineering notebook, where you're taking notes of what's going on. And quite specifically, one of the things that we've planned into this is that this is due the week after the debrief, if I have that correct. And that means that the process of writing the project requirements and the response to the debrief are all things that you can comment on. And while one of the things you're going to be practicing by writing this document is good paragraph structure, good sentence structure, and stuff like that, that is not of the primary importance for this iteration of it. This is an iterative document, and this document sets up, it's the foundation of the lessons learned and strategies that you'll hand in midway through the term in about 2 months. This one simply looks at situations and identifies yourself in the situations and analyzes them. And you'll notice that in this required content, I only have describe, identify strategies, and identify your role. The one I initially posted online had 2 more bullet points, but the CIs said take them out. So I didn't take them out, I drew a line through them in case anybody was confused. This is what you have to do. This is not an analytical document. You're not judging what you're observing at this point. You're just observing it and saying, maybe I can do this, but basically you're observing it and writing about what you observe. There's no page limit or word limit, but you should keep it under 2 pages. Even under a page is fine. It's only worth 3 marks. The lessons learned and strategies is worth 12 marks later in the term. So this one is a low impact assignment where we're looking for your ability to describe meaningful events that you were involved with in your team. So the 2 key words there are meaningful and you. And that will set the foundation for the LLS, which is worth a lot more marks, and you will get lots of feedback on the way from your communication instructor as they look at this and focus on the substance of it, and then as you work toward the actual LLS a few weeks later. Thank you very much, and we'll have a good rest of your week.